Is this the normal amount of people that are here? So should we be expecting more, less? More? It might be because of the hockey game tonight. There are people out. They're going to that. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to that too, but I'm here. So that's okay. We'll wait just a second to get started here.
What time's the game?
Like 7, I think. I think people might have left early to try to miss the traffic. So yeah, I just want to make sure we're not leaving anybody out that's supposed to be here. But yeah, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Well, everybody, good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming, even if you're going to the hockey game shortly. I appreciate you spending your afternoon with me. You might be thinking this does not look like Professor Verma or Lydia, and that's because I'm not. My name is Riley. I'm a PhD candidate here. Here in my second year, I do research with Professor Verma and Todd Allen. And I primarily do research in fuel cycle policy and in siting regulation. And as Professor Verma is out for this week, she asked me to come fill in for her. So on Wednesday, I'll be with you guys and we'll be doing some work with siting. But today, we're going to be going over the history of nuclear waste management. It's a very fascinating story, something that I really love to enjoy and I love to talk about. So I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Got a lot to cover today, so we'll just go ahead and get started. So, putting into context what the nuclear waste issue is today. There's about 90,000 tons of spent nuclear fuel on site of reactor facilities, and the Department of Energy has to pay anywhere between $500 and $800 million per year as a result of a lack of a repository or another institutional way to get this waste handled. There's a lot of waste at plants that have been decommissioned. For example, San Onofre out in California, that's a decommissioned shutdown reactor that they've got waste on site. And a lot of the communities that are around these facilities did not consent to or did not have the opportunity to consent to these extended periods of interim waste being stored nearby as a function of just the institutional processes that were going on at the time. And we'll talk about and deconstruct all of that here shortly. But just to recap what is happening today, we're doing a little bit in terms of waste management. Certainly not nothing, but not quite enough. We're not getting to where we need to go. We have new efforts in consolidated storage and reprocessing, fairly new as of the past couple months, perhaps you've talked about it already, and still very little movement on the repositories. So, how did we get here? How did we get to the point where we're having all of this waste building up on reactor sites and very little reprocessing and we don't know what we're going to do about it? Well, we had a repository program, it kind of floundered and died out. We deferred reprocessing back in the 70s as a policy matter, and anything that we were doing in terms of consolidated storage had very poor coordination when that was going on back a couple decades ago. Why should we care about this? A lot of this context is very necessary when you're trying to really understand the problems that we're facing today. They provide a lot of insights, and most importantly, so that we're making sure that we're not repeating history, that we're learning the right lessons from what's happened previously, and that we're making sure that we're approaching these new problems with the right contexts and the right programs in mind. So, just for your all's reference, what I want you to take away from today, specifically any governing legislation and regulation on this stuff, current policy approaches, the historic eras that led us to get to this point, and the other alternatives to what we could be doing today, and also the historical alternatives to what was done in the past. I also want you to think about these two questions while we're going along. I'm not going to answer them explicitly, and we won't have too much time to discuss, but I want you to think about these and try to connect them as I go. Number one, how do we consider scientific uncertainty in policy making? We're making decisions in the wake of a lot of uncertainty here. How are those decisions made, and what do we do about it? Second, what necessitates different decision-making structures in each case? We're going to be talking about a whole bunch of different cases in nuclear waste management today. How do these decision-making structures influence the different outcomes for these cases? We're going to be talking about primarily repositories and consolidated storage today. If we have time at the end, we'll touch on reprocessing and low-level waste, but I want to make sure that we have time to really get into the details of all of this and make sure that we have sufficient discussion with all of you guys that are here. So also just to clarify, we're going to be talking more specifically about the United States. This is not an international comparison by any means. If we wanted to do that, that would take up another 1 or 2 extra lectures. So we're just focusing on the US today, even though there are very valuable lessons to learn internationally. So before we get into it, just any questions, any thoughts on waste management stuff? Nothing burning? All right, we'll get into it. So the first thing talking about, we'll be going into what I like to call the prehistory of waste management, everything between 1946 and about 1954 or so, before the National Academies made a recommendation for geologic repositories, up until we get to the formulation of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act in 1982. So, in the beginning, Congress created the Atomic Energy Commission via the Atomic Energy Act. Big surprise, really big deal, I know. So, this act, also otherwise known as the McMahon Act, perhaps you can guess why. This is our friend Brian over here, and he wrote the thing. You can assume what his last name is. And the Atomic Energy Commission was formed in 1946 after the war for these express purposes: to foster private research, to control scientific information. You can guess maybe why that was important in 1946. For federal research and development into nuclear matters, for the government production and ownership of source material, primarily for defense purposes, and for international cooperation and leadership. Most explicitly, there was no mention of waste back in these days. Back in 1946, we didn't think it was that big of a problem. And in about 1950 was about the time that enough people had been thinking about this stuff for long enough that we could do a review on it. And so the first one that I found was from scientists from Oak Ridge talking about these different approaches for how we might go about radioactive waste disposal and management. And one quote that I really like from this, and I'll be giving you a lot of quotes today, but this is straight from the paper: "Given a little more time, these problems will be resolved just as others have been in the past." So they were very confident back in 1950. They'd been studying waste management for about 4 years, and are like, all right, we got this, we can figure it out. And we're here today talking about it and deconstructing everything. So how time flies, I suppose. So back in the early days, there was a whole laundry list of potential options that were really seriously being considered. And these are not, I mean, some of them may seem silly on its face, but a lot of these were really being considered and were very promising for the time. So number one, chemical separation. We weren't concerned about permanent disposal because we had reprocessing. We knew how to do it. We were doing that stuff very, very early in nuclear history and breeding and reprocessing and stuff like that. Cement confinement, that works. We've been doing that for a long time. Dump it in the ocean was the next idea. And then to dump it in the rivers or to dump it in the sewers, because people were fairly confident at that time that the water treatment systems could actually handle these sorts of wastes. And then getting away from the throwing it in the water streams, then we also said, oh, what if we just burned it? I think that'll be fine. My favorite, unfortunately I don't know too much about it because the program didn't last for very long, the mysterious bacterial slime. They reported on this back in this review by the Atomic Energy Commission. There was a lot of work being done in bacterial slimes to consolidate waste into one spot. I saw something that they showed that it worked for phosphorus 32, and that the next plan was for iodine 131, and then I didn't see anything after that. So I'm not sure if the iodine slime didn't quite work out. I don't know. But just to put into context the sorts of mindsets that these scientists had at the time and what the common knowledge was. This is from a report that came out of Los Alamos. Radioactivity discharged to streams, rivers, and lakes will tend to be concentrated by the aquatic life, which apparently is not harmed by the radioactivity normally present in the wastes. So back in the 50s, we weren't really concerned about ingestion of radionuclides, especially within aquatic plants and animals. These days we think much differently, but back then it was not much of a concern. And one final thing to leave you with, just putting into context how this ocean disposal thing was going, because we're going to be talking more about ocean disposal in a moment. Ocean dispersal, properly managed, will undoubtedly be safe by all measurable standards for some years to come. And a number of calculations have been made in support of such conclusions. the serious problems resulting from widespread ocean dispersal would simply be reserved for future generations. That was a quote from a scientist at Brookhaven National Lab back in 1953. So we talk all the time about how these scientists back in the day were inconsiderate about future generations. Well, there is proof for you. Go look at what was coming out of Brookhaven at the time, although I think the author said none of these are representative of the institution. These are my own opinions or whatever else. So we walked away from everything else aside from ocean dispersal and geologic containment. We identified that those were the two most promising. Sorry, slime, we're not going with you today. And here's a report from something that I really enjoy. If you know your Latin, it'll make sense. This is from Vitro Corporation, to solidify and confine or turn into rock, where they made a cement monolith, is what they called it. It's very imaginative. It was like a 6-foot diameter by 14 feet tall concrete monolith that they would dilute the radionuclides in and then dump it in the ocean, and then it would only leach about 5% of its activity every 15 days. So it's pretty good. Seems all right. The Atomic Energy Commission was happy with that. But that was more specifically if we were looking at dispersal. So a lot of the arguments and the debates that were happening at the time, should we focus on the dispersal of radionuclides and the dilution in water, or should we try to confine it and keep it into one place? In 1954, a group of scientists got together and discussed this in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. There's a very famous oceanographic institute. If any of you have been up there, that's what they were doing. And from this report, they concluded that ocean disposal would not be a promising solution. There were just too many uncertainties. They didn't know about the ecology down there. They didn't know about the environment. They didn't know about water circulation. So most importantly, if you go back into these reports, they were confident that there was very little up and down flow between different layers in the ocean. And the side to side, the horizontal flow was primarily a function of wind. Now these days, we know that there are salt and temperature gradients that cause a lot of movements underground. Like the Atlantic conveyor belt, I think we've discovered now. So it's a good idea we didn't do that because they had no idea about this underwater movement for a very, very long time. Fun fact, after there were nuclear weapons testing out in the Pacific, those radionuclides that were dispersed from those weapons were used as tracers to prove these theories for ocean circulation. So it's a fun little roundabout fact. Nice that these things all come together. It's a shame that it happens as a function of weapons, but yeah, what's up?
Were they at all worried about like heavy metal poisoning or any of the other effects besides radiation?
Yeah, they were more so concerned about heavy metal poisoning than radiation. Like I said earlier, they were convinced that the radiation would be held by the local wildlife, and that wouldn't get to people. The concern was not about the environment. The concern was the people, mostly. And so they said, since the radionuclides are getting absorbed, all this is coming in, then the risk of the heavy metal poisoning is much lower, right? So they were concerned about that, mainly for people, not for the environment. Also, they didn't know about like deep sea creatures back in these times. They would have been dumping that concrete monolith on some little octopus or something, so good thing we didn't do that. In 1955, the Atomic Energy Commission essentially saw this and said, well, we're out of options. Seems like geologic disposal is the best approach. Not necessarily that it's the best, but it's the least bad. So in 1955, the Atomic Energy Commission commissions the National Academies of Science to study this. They studied it for a couple of years, and in 1957, they came up with their recommendations, a very pivotal report in this whole sort of thing, the disposal of radioactive waste on land back in 1957, where their conclusion was disposal in salts is the most promising method for the near future. They were convinced that confinement within salts was a very good option. Now I'm going to ask you why. Any materials people here today? No materials people. Any guesses as to why salt seems like a good option for confinement here? Yeah.
It's really geographic. It's very stable.
It's very stable, yeah, sure. So we can see it around here. It's stable in one aspect, but the other aspect is that it's in a sense plastic. So it'll flow. It's self-healing, actually. Any other reasons that anybody can think of? How about the thermal properties of salt? Yeah, what's up?
High
high heat capacity, great conductivity too. So if anything happens, like the salt can diffuse the temperature away fairly well and nothing terribly bad will happen. It's also impervious to water. Water can't get through. And also this isn't just like table salt. Like this is like a 3-kilometer deposit. Like these are huge. So very impervious to water. And also in these areas of the country that they've identified, we can see here in Louisiana, Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, also up over home with us in Michigan and in Pennsylvania, New York. A lot of good options. And all of these around the country, they were low seismic activity and flat areas. So we thought that they would be good. 1958 shipping port goes critical. So that's when the waste really starts to come about here. Also mentioned in the report is specifically the Lyons Mining District here in Kansas. And after this report is made, the Atomic Energy Commission goes and studies this site. There are a whole bunch of salt mines in the area, and they started studying this in 1960. In 1970, after a whole bunch of engineering tests, they decided, yes, this will be good for a repository. We will continue with the repository here. Now comes our first really political, legal question of whether or not the Atomic Energy Commission had the authority to make this repository. The Atomic Energy Commission's opinion was that this is just an extension of a prior engineering project, that we don't necessarily need new authority because it's not new technology, we're just expanding on what we've already done. Kansas lawmakers claimed that this is a new technology, this requires a new regulatory approach. You have unclear authority from your statutes in Congress, from the 1946 Nuclear Waste Policy Act and another one that was passed in 1954. So who wins? It eventually turns out that the Atomic Energy Commission withdraws in 1972 among those concerns, those political concerns as well as environmental concerns. I mentioned how impervious the salt is to water flow, but the problem with the Lyons site is there was a lot of drilling and a lot of mining. And so all the good parts about that impermeability kind of go away when you drill holes, a whole bunch of holes into it. So because of those challenges, this site was abandoned by the Atomic Energy Commission in 1972. It's also important to know here that the Atomic Energy Commission was not actually obligated to be doing this at the time. They were recommended to, but they didn't have to. There was no statute telling them they had to do so, which came about, which brought about some of those other problems, those legal problems I just mentioned. In 1974, this is part of a much larger story of reactor history as to why the Atomic Energy Commission went away. But in 1974, the Energy Reorganization Act splits the Atomic Energy Agency into the NRC and ERDA, where the NRC is the regulatory arm and ERDA is the research and development arm that were both formally in the Atomic Energy Commission. In 1977, that still wasn't really working out, and so they created the Department of Energy, or the DOE absorbed ERDA and another non-nuclear energy agency. And it's a very similar DOE to what we have today. So you can see there, they had express authority now because Congress knew that the DOE had to do something about it. So that's text from the statute, giving them authority to be managing this nuclear waste. But another issue at the time was in 1977, we weren't really worried about needing a repository because we thought reprocessing would be just fine. And if we have time, we'll get into the story of reprocessing a little bit later, but in 1977, it was effectively outlawed by President Carter in cooperation with the European Atomic Energy Agency, or the European Atomic Energy Commission, I think. So because of that, because of this executive order to halt all developments in reprocessing, there was nothing about reprocessing in the DOE Organization Act, and therefore reprocessing languished forever up until a couple weeks ago. Stop here now. We're going to take a quick, well, we'll continue on with this, but any questions up until this point? All right. Yeah, so.
Is the salt why there's so many like hazardous waste disposals in Michigan now?
I'm not sure. I don't think those hazardous waste facilities that you're talking about are deep geologic things. I'm not entirely familiar with non-nuclear waste disposal, at least in that context. I would be surprised, but Michigan does have its own interesting stories. If we get to talking about low-level waste, hopefully we'll get to that. Yeah. So
So for the a large salt deposit in western Texas. It overlaps with the Permian Basin, which became the gas and oil thing, and it's become one of the highest seismic activity zones in the desert.
Yeah, very smart, very smart. Yes, the Permian Basin is there. And you're jumping ahead a couple decades. So we'll get back to that later maybe. But yes, you're exactly right. And that was a big reason. We're going to come back to the Permian Basin here. Don't you worry. But Texas was very concerned about these things because of the Permian Basin. That comes up a lot in a lot of the lawsuits that are happening eventually. So one final thing, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act is passed in 1982, but in 1981, the Department of Energy authorizes WIP. Perhaps you've talked about this earlier, but this was immediately before the Department of Energy was made responsible for managing nuclear waste, for commercial nuclear waste. But in this phase, they cited a deep geologic repository in a salt deposit in New Mexico, and that was for the express purpose of storing government waste and defense waste. This was certified by the EPA, not the NRC, and they received decent community support by the local counties and states, or state, New Mexico specifically. So WIP is starting. We'll see WIP come back throughout this, but we have the first start of a geologic repository that's not Lions, and we're making on with it. So we'll come back to these guys in New Mexico later. In 1982, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act came along and really changed a whole bunch. They needed to do this after Lions and after the reprocessing ban because there were so many institutional problems. Now we have a federal system that authorized and incentivized commercial repository programs because the DOE has a time limit. They are supposed to take title to all this waste by 1998, and if they do not, they're responsible for all damages incurred. So if you remember, I talked about the somewhere between $500 and $800 million. That's as a function of this. Perhaps some of you have heard before that the Department of Energy holds title to all the nuclear waste in the United States. I've heard that a lot. It's not quite true. The Department of Energy does not own that waste. It's still owned by the utilities. But they will assume, and they're supposed to assume title once there's a repository. Obviously, there's not one. There's also a nuclear waste fund. This was charged at about 1/10 of a cent per kilowatt hour to be funded by the ratepayers, the people who are receiving nuclear power in their homes, which today amasses to about $40 billion. This is not just free funds the Department of Energy can use. This needs to be apportioned by Congress. This needs to be passed in a bill. So today, this money is all locked up because it's supposed to be for the express purpose of a repository, and we're not working on one. Also in 1982, they said that the Department of Energy can store temporarily up to 10,000 tons of spent nuclear fuel in a program that they called monitor retrievable storage that we'll get back to. But what I want to ask you is why? Why did they say 10,000 tons? They could have said more, they could have said none. They could have not capped it. So why place that cap on the amount of temporary storage the Department of Energy can issue? These are mostly for reactors that are in the decommissioning process, and they can move it away from the decommissioning site. Why 10,000 tons? Why a cap at all? Any thoughts? Any thoughts? So they wanted to incentivize the Department of Energy to get on with it, basically. They didn't want to have an infinite cap that they could just move all their stuff to the monitor retrievable storage. They had this here so that the Department of Energy had some pressure. And a lot of this was spurred on by the utilities because they had this waste piling up that they were arguing that the federal government should take authority for. And so that's why this act got started in 1982. There was an additional second repository planned in the eastern United States at this time. So we're going to focus on one in the west, or one like west of the Mississippi, sort of. And then after they got that one done, in 1998, we're going to do another one. This will be solved like all other problems have been solved before, right? So after 1982, after this law was passed, they gave the Department of Energy 180 days to identify 9 sites. So we have in the blue, these are all the sites that were studied, and also the ones in orange were studied and were recommended to Congress by the Department of Energy. The Congress took one of those 3. So we can see most of these, and also here's WIP. So WIP is in the salt deposit near the Permian Basin. But we have, most of these are around salt deposits. So we have these in eastern Mississippi and in Louisiana. These, a few that are near the Paradox Basin, Utah and Colorado, and Texas as well. And one of these was eventually approved or sent to Congress, and a key reason as to why that was opposed was because of the problems with the Permian Basin. But what I want to ask you, oh my gosh, we have these justifications for these sites in these salt deposits based on what the National Academy said, and the Department of Energy said, we would also like to nominate these two. There's one in Washington and one in Nevada. These are not salt deposits. This is not going with the National Academy's recommendations. So where do these come from? What in the world is possibly going on in Washington and Nevada at this time? Somebody tell me. Either one, yeah.
Is it weapons testing?
So there's weapons testing in Nevada. That's the Nevada weapons, yeah, I forget the name of it, but yes, they were doing weapons testing out in Nevada. What's up?
Isn't southeast Washington where the Richmond nuclear power plant is?
Very close. That's where Hanford is. So it's Richlands, and they're all in the Tri-Cities area of Washington, or around there. And so they were doing weapons testing down in Nevada, and they were doing plutonium production with Hanford up in Washington. I don't know whether you guys have talked about Hanford, but Hanford is like a permanent environmental problem for the Department of Energy. So they were trying to kill two birds with one stone here with Hanford and the Nevada testing site, which we now know to be Yucca Mountain. We'll talk about that. But there was a lot of opposition to this naturally because these sites were not systematically chosen. Certainly some of these have justification with the National Academy's report, but these other two, the two that were recommended to Congress, they were, in a lot of people's eyes, unscientific. They didn't have the same justification that these other ones did. So there were a lot of people quite unhappy because they believed that the DOE was doing bad science, which is funny to hear about. So Congress thinks about this for a while, and in 1987, they select Nevada, Yucca Mountain, as the final repository location. They eliminate the secondary repository program. That is no longer an option. They think it is an untenable path forward. So they focus only on the one, and they choose Nevada. Why? Why do they choose Nevada? Why do they get rid of the secondary repository program? Well, the nuclear industry is not at a good place in time right now. The year is 1987. Can somebody tell me what happened in 1986? Speak loudly. Chernobyl. Chernobyl was in 1986. So it was very unpopular. Nuclear was quite unpopular at this time, and Congress needed to do what they could do to get this thing passed. A great history of it is in this book, and they talk about the political issues that were going on surrounding this stuff and influencing the decisions that they were making to get to these amendments in 1987. In 1982, have you guys talked about closure in this class? Like different paths to closure for like design and policy stuff? Yeah. So with that in mind, in 1982, Congress was essentially trying to achieve technological closure of this problem. They were trying to get the best science on this and get a scientific decision. And for reasons that we will talk about on the next slide, in 1987, they had to mandate closure, a sort of political or administrative closure. So we have a shift in 5 years between thinking that science is going to get us there to saying we have to step in and do something. The science is not good enough. So the debate over Yucca Mountain, this was immediately before it was selected in the 1987 amendments, and it continued on for a very long time. Number one, what is the geology? Well, it sure ain't salt. More specifically, it's volcanic tuff. And a lot of people were skeptical of it, mostly because, again, the salt recommendations were fine. Why are we not doing that anymore? And number two, a lot of people were very much concerned with the hydrology of the site. Most specifically, our friends at the Department of the Interior and scientists within the United States Geologic Survey, here's a quote, The single most critical need for information concerns the issue of whether or not the hydrology of a potential site can be adequately characterized. There is almost no information on hydrology at repository depths in areas screened by DOE. So they're not messing around. They are not happy with what's going on at the DOE. They do not think that they're doing the right stuff. DOE thinks that they are. They have geologists and hydrologists on their team. They think they're in the right. So who's right? The answer is nobody. And another thing this plays into is the deep time uncertainty of it all. So when people were making critiques that this was not being managed within salt deposits, the response was that the national academies were primarily concerned with confinement for the short term rather than confinement in deep time. So they weren't thinking about 10,000, 100,000 million years in the future like we are now and like they were back then. So the Department of Energy said, well, any of your concerns with salt deposits, nobody has any justification for anything anymore. So we've been going back and forth about this for about 5 years, and we're nowhere close to an answer on what the technically best, the most technically capable site is. A great quote on this from the book that I just mentioned. Quote, the emphasis on technical over political decisions did not consider that science is actually fragmented among a variety of perspectives, which with competing groups each claiming possession of facts and objectivity. For a new technology, technical and peer review processes were as likely to reveal the diversity of fact and opinion as they were to produce convergence and consensus on the facts. So what does that mean? We have different interpretations of the same facts here. We have smart people. Nobody's doing bad science. And the hypotheses that they have are not necessarily exclusive. But what this means is that there's no technical closure. There's no path forward because there's so much uncertainty in what's actually happening. Because we're looking at stuff, we have methods of characterizing hydrology and the geology. But now at this time, we have no idea what we're talking about 10,000 years in the future, which really put a stick in our spokes. So Congress stepped in and made a decision. They said, we're doing Yucca Mountain and we're going forward. So here's a very pivotal point in how we're talking about scientific uncertainty and how we make decisions in policy. This is not unique, of course, to waste management. This is very pervasive in all other planning fields. Any thoughts, any questions on this so far? No? Feeling good? All right. So for a while now, the Department of Energy has been working on studying Yucca Mountain, and they were trying to get it licensed. For a while, there were a lot of disagreements, especially immediately after the amendment was passed, with the safety standards and who's making them. A lot of the criticism was, what authority does the Nuclear Regulatory Commission have to be doing this stuff? Right? The EPA has already been working on this with WIP. Why isn't EPA involved? Congress said, oh, good point. Let's get the EPA involved. And I said, well, how is the EPA going to know what to do? Where are they going to get their standards from? They're a regulatory agency, not a scientific agency, and there's still a lot of scientific problems with this. Congress said, okay, we'll get the National Academies involved too. So in the first part, before 1992, when the Energy Policy Act of 1992 was passed, the NRC was in charge of making regulation and enforcing them, and the DOE was going to implement them. After that, Congress said the National Academies are going to make the scientific standards, which was passed 3 years later. Then the EPA is going to make their regulations, then the NRC is going to interpret their regulations into their own regulations, and then the DOE is going to implement it, right? So in 1987, Congress recognized that there would be no technical closure on which repository site was the best. But certainly there is a case to be made that there is technological closure possible if we've already come to that decision. And saying, how do we make sure that we build the best repository with what we have now? So the intent was to try to make a more rigorous approach for technological closure, but at the risk of very severe bureaucratic consequences that we will see soon. Obviously, it took the National Academies 3 years to issue their standards. And before the DOE could even think about doing that, they had to answer to 2 other agencies. So another break. WIP is finished. Hooray. Great job, DOE. This comes following the WIP Land Withdrawal Act, which was also passed in 1992, which consolidated a whole bunch of federal land that was owned by the Department of the Interior or Defense or whatever into the hands of the DOE, and it gave New Mexico a certain level of regulatory authority over what was going on, mostly pertaining to hazardous waste management, nothing environmental. That was still primarily managed by the EPA. And still today, the EPA is the one who regulates and manages that and the environmental compliance, not the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Keep in mind, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is for commercial, while WIP is for defense-based. That's about the end of the story for WIP. It's largely a success story. Of course, there are lessons to be learned, but also it is very dependent on this context, especially with this starting before the NWPA was passed, and also that it's handling defense waste. As a quick aside, it was placed on standby between 2014 and 2017. I'm not going to get into the reasons, but I would definitely recommend you look into them. There was a fire and they had to shut it down, but they're back up and they're still accepting waste today. So good job, WIP. In 2002, Yucca was approved. The process went something like the Department of Energy recommends that this is a good site. So they'd still been doing site characterization this whole time after hearing back from the recommendations of National Academies, the EPA, and the NRC. The president approved the project. They sent it to Congress. The state may veto after that, and if they veto, then Congress can override the veto. And that's exactly what happened. Nobody was expecting anything different. Nevada vetoed, and then Congress overrid their veto. Yucca is on. So my question, another question for you is, why even have the veto in the first place? Nobody was expecting Congress to not override the veto. It had already been around for so long, and this was written in 20 years ago. So we've been working on this thing for 20 years. So why even entertain the idea of a veto when we know that Congress is going to overrule it anyways? Back then we were certain Congress was going to do it. I can think of two reasons why they would include that. Yeah.
They want their constituents to think they're fighting for them, and they want to make it seem like they were never on the pro team if it goes wrong.
Yeah, certainly that's one of them. That you want to make sure that constituents have a part in the decision-making process, right? Yeah.
At a minimum, to be able to document the veto as a way of documenting the voice of the people.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's not, but yeah, so that if something does go wrong, they can say, well, we attempted to tell you.
Yeah, yeah, and I forgot to mention one thing as to why Nevada was selected. Specifically, Nevada was chosen as the site because they were the politically weakest at the time. So it's saying we're dealing with the political issues surrounding Chernobyl in 1986. We got to get this thing passed. We eliminate the second repository program because we're trying to gain popularity. We want the eastern powerful states to not think that we're going to put a repository there. And we also have to choose between Texas, Washington, and Nevada, which one is going to put up the least amount of a fight. That was about the justification for why they chose Yucca Mountain. So we knew that we were choosing and we were picking on the weakest politically. There was no justification, there was no technical justification as to why Yucca Mountain was the best here. Did you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, probably, if there would be a lawsuit,
Mm-hmm.
or to go to the Supreme Court or court, like, that's probably a significant part.
Just
towards
put
the veto.
Right. Yeah. Just put some guardrails here, some procedural guardrails. I can think of one more that's a little bit more indirect. The veto incentivized the Department of Energy to locate and to find politically weak locations. The DOE is not going to go in and try to find a state that's going to put up a fight with this because they know it's going to get vetoed and they're going to have egg on their face. So they know that there's a risk that this could get vetoed. So the Department of Energy was focusing on a lot of these sites, specifically with Yucca Mountain, where there's nobody living there within like 10 miles. Same with Hanford, there's not a lot of people there. And in the desert in Texas, they're not going to put up much of a fight. So that was a secondary reason I can think as to why to include that. A bit nefarious, but it happened. So going along with all this bureaucracy problems, there was a lawsuit in 2004, because we love our lawsuits. There's the NEI versus the EPA, and the argument was the EPA set a regulatory limit we have to be able to prove that our facilities will be functional for 10,000 years. And the NEI said that is not long enough. NES didn't really say anything about a specific time. They just said until there is insignificant risk. So it was up to the EPA to interpret that. But then the court said that 10,000 years is not enough. Go back to the drawing board. And so they made a new set of standards a couple years later that instead of doing 10,000, it was 1 million. They said, screw you guys, we're coming with the biggest number we can. Right, so it made a lot of problems. But in 2008, the license was eventually submitted to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. But through all of this, we have to remember that Congress did not fully know that this site was going to be capable in 2002 when it was approved. This was a risk that they were taking. They still had to do a lot of study. There was still a lot of uncertainty, but they still made the decision. In 2010, Yucca Mountain was canceled. I think this quote best summarizes it by the Energy Secretary of the time. I think we can do a better job. I agree. It was canceled primarily due to political reasons. If you go look up this period of time and look up the Energy Secretary, there's like a bombshell report that he was not listening to the technical experts at the time. That was not the concern. The concern was absolutely within the politics. And because of this, because it was canceled in 2010, NRC licensing never concluded. They never got their license. We were fairly confident that they would have met those standards, but they never got their license. This caused a lot more lawsuits. People sued the federal government because Congress passed a law in 2002 saying that Yucca Mountain was going to be the repository. The president said, we're not going to do it anymore. So people sued the president and the Secretary of Energy because they were not properly executing the laws. And so, putting on your lawyer hats, I'm trying to think about what the defense argument was in that case. How was Yucca Mountain canceled if Congress authorized it in 2002? Congress made the law, and the only people who can do anything about laws are Congress in this country, ostensibly, right? So how did we cancel Yucca Mountain if it's still a law? You had your hand up?
Sovereign immunity?
Sorry, not quite. Any hands over here?
I mean, the only way to undo a law that's passed by Congress is through the judicial branch, so a lawsuit.
Lawsuits,
All the way to the
yes.
Supreme Court if it has to.
Yes. Thinking a little bit more circus, right? Not quite. There might have been an executive order in there, but not quite. Essentially, this is a trick question. Yucca Mountain was never canceled. Yucca Mountain is still on the books because nobody can make any laws about it except for Congress. And we know what Congress loves to do, not pass laws. So Yucca was never legally canceled. It was just administratively defunded and withdrawn from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So there was never any legal problems. It was just like rules lawyering that came about. So the insight into this is Yucca Mountain is still the only authorized repository site today. You can't put a repository anywhere else. If you wanted to do anything with a repository, you got to get through Congress and get rid of Yucca Mountain. So that's where we stand. In 2010, after Yucca was canceled, the Office of the President and the Department of Energy created what they called the Blue Ribbon Commission. They made a Blue Ribbon Commission report on America's nuclear future, where they assessed the different ways forward, especially in the wake of disclosure. They had 8 recommendations, including consent-based siting, which we'll talk about, and we'll also talk about on Wednesday. Can you read it? Yeah, you can read this. So this wasn't really all that long ago. These are likely people that you know. John Kotek is on the board of directors here, or I think that's what it's called, for the department. Allison McFarland, she became the NRC chair shortly after this was passed. Richard Meserve, I know him from the National Academies, and he was also a previous NRC chair. So these people are still around. If you want to go talk to them, you can ask them about it. They're a better resource certainly than I am. But they did a lot of great work on this and making a lot of headway post Yucca Mountain. And so these were their recommendations. Consent-based siting approach. It is exactly as it sounds. We should get permission from the people before we put something there. They've also said we need to create a new organization that's not the Department of Energy to be in charge of this. Their reasoning was that the Department of Energy is wildly unpopular, and so if we just start from scratch, hopefully it'll fix it. Unlocking the Nuclear Waste Fund. Like I said, that $40 billion or so nuclear waste fund that exists that has been paid by ratepayers is behind congressional apportion, and so they are trying to ask for that to be apportioned. Makes sense. restart the repository siting process, do away with Yucca Mountain, establish a consolidated storage program. We'll talk about that in just one moment. And also logistics improvements, continued technical and workforce development, and also international leadership. So those are the 8 conclusions that they came up with in that report. It's very influential for whatever future plans we may have for repository development. We're not quite there yet. But as we wrap up this story of the repositories, here are some takeaways I want to leave you with. There were many feasible ideas before we came to the repository. We may think now that anything else other than deep geologic repositories are silly, but there were a lot that seemed really quite feasible back at the time. Lions was canceled due to technical and legal issues that were addressed by Yucca Mountain and the Department of Energy Organization Act. WIP, we can generally view as a success due to seeing institutional and governmental alignment within the siting and development process. And Yucca Mountain was ultimately canceled because it was an ill-posed project to begin with. And it was incredibly bureaucratic, and it was very difficult to get things done through the approval processes. So it was a weird mix of top-down and bottom-up approaches, and they were never able to meet. Scientific uncertainty really affected the pathways to closure in 1982 and 1987. As we learn more, we become less and less certain of our scientific abilities, actually, and the ability that this will lead to a consensus. And then also the practical implications today are that we cannot do anything without congressional intervention because that's still on the books. Thoughts, questions? Moving on from repositories, we're going to get to consolidated storage here. All right. So the story of the consolidated storage program, I like this GIF for this context because you'll see momentarily. But just showing the approach here of what the Department of Energy had in mind, they were authorized to have a monitor retrievable storage program, and they were doing research on it. And the idea was we're going to store it temporarily somewhere in the east, and then once we get a repository, we're going to bring it out to the west. Makes sense, and that was the plan until they made the recommendation to Congress in 1985, and in 1987 they said, you're not going to do that, actually, and you're going to stop doing work on this forever. So that didn't last for very long. They had the authority to do so in that second quote, or in that first quote, but that second quote you can see there, proposal of the Secretary to locate an MRS at a site in Clinch River, which is where it was, is annulled and revoked. It's very simple and elegant, primarily due to opposition from lawmakers in Tennessee and other people around because nuclear was very unpopular. They had to do what they needed to do to get this thing done. Also created in 1987 with the amendments to the Nuclear Waste Policy Act was the Office of the Nuclear Waste Negotiator. Show of hands, who's heard of this before? I was like, no, nobody. I think this is the most rich part in all of the history of nuclear waste management. And we'll get into talking about it here. But they were founded technically in 1987 at the direction of Congress, but a negotiator was not appointed until 1990. And this federal organization was independent from the Department of Energy, at least administratively. I believe they got their funding through the DOE. But they made the Office of the Nuclear Waste Negotiator to attempt to invite repository and monitor retrievable storage development in a sort of bottom-up approach. How do we get people to come to us to say that they want this stuff, and then we'll help them work it out and we'll offer funding? Not many people were interested in a repository because it was very politically toxic, but there were more people who were eventually interested in the monitor retrievable storage and this temporary storage that they did issue a significant number in grant funding for study. So in finding these places, they issued funding announcements in 3 phases. There's about 100,000, 200,000, and like 3 million. So the first phase was for, these first couple of phases were just for like feasibility and then trying to get into actual development. The key point here is the majority of these applicants were tribes. They were Native American tribal nations. Some of them were counties, and there were no states. So we can see the different sorts of government bodies. These local level organizations and agencies are interested, but the states are not. Another fun point about this is in the applications for like phase 1, which is that $100,000 grant, people would apply to try to disprove that the MRS would be feasible in their location. Some did that anyways, and they got around it. So they essentially got money to try to prove that this thing isn't suitable. But that's what they did. So yeah. Gonna get into the negotiating process here. Content warning. I bet you all weren't expecting that. There's some sensitive racial and religious topics here. We'll get through it. But just keep that in mind. Don't want to surprise you guys. So the backdrop to this, I mentioned that a lot of tribal nations were interested in this. And this is because it was in an era of tribal self-determination and self-governance. And a lot of tribes were getting together to try to think about how they can do resource development and try to have strength through their sovereignty. A much wider discussion on the place of the Native American tribes in the United States. But at this point in time, they were trying to consolidate a lot of that authority and decision-making power. And one example of that is the Council of Energy Resource Tribes that was founded in 1975. For those of you that are familiar with OPEC, it was kind of exactly like OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, where they consolidated together to try to get political strength and political capital with their resources. This was not necessarily popular with every tribe and every person in tribes. This was a point of a lot of diverging opinions. But CERT eventually entered into negotiating meetings with the Office of the Nuclear Waste Negotiator. And we can see here in the first quote, this is from an executive of CERT. And we can see into their mindset at like the leadership level, saying we need to understand what our neighbor needs and to also ask in return which is needed for our family survival. So essentially it was saying, you know, what can we do for those around us? What can we get from them if we do it? Because we have the means, and they were trying to really use their sovereignty here to get something. That was not popular, but that was what they were trying to do. Another thing, and this I want to spend some time thinking about this, the nuclear waste negotiator at the time, his name was David Leroy, in response to some concerns that were being had in these negotiating meetings, it was recorded that he used this quote from Chief Seattle in 1855. Chief Seattle was a Duwamish chief in what is now Washington State. Maybe you know the name, Seattle. Quote, "To us the ashes are sacred and their resting place is hallowed ground." Think about that. Additional context, the ashes of their ancestors, and they're scattered everywhere across the country. Also keep in mind that the majority of the applicants in this process were tribes. So it was a very common concern that the office was targeting Native American tribes for this purpose. They weren't, they were going based off of applications, but it was a very big concern that a lot of people had. And so in response to that concern, this is what the negotiator said. "To us, the ashes are sacred and their resting place is hallowed ground." What might somebody interpret that to mean? What do you think he was trying to convey with saying that? Yes?
I mean, based on the two quotes from David and then this other David.
David L, yes.
Right, it sounds like they're trying to make it sound like they want to be of help and to find a mutual benefit, but if the hollow ground is expansive,
Yep.
then they're at a standstill.
Almost. So David, he is the negotiator for the Office of the Nuclear Waste Negotiator. He works for the federal government, and he's trying to get this thing signed. Any other interpretations of what he meant here? Thoughts?
Like, we want to use somebody else's land and not our own?
Very close. So the concern that people were having were like, why are you trying to put this thing on native land when there's so much land out there? And the response by the negotiator was, and saying, here's your guy, Chief Seattle, very important historically, saying, all of this country is native land. What should it matter if it's on a reservation or not?
What do you do with that?
That's not great. And moreover, there's more context to that quote that was not encompassed when he said this. The full quote, the context is that this was a speech of surrender by Chief Seattle in the 1855 Puget Sound Wars, or the Puget Sound War, between the Eastern Colonials and the tribes that were there at the time. Full quote. "We are two distinct races and must ever remain so. There is little in common between us. To us, the ashes of our ancestors are sacred and their resting place is hallowed ground. You wander far from the graves of your ancestors and seemingly without regret. Your religion was written upon tablets of stone by the iron finger of your God so that you could not forget." That last part being essentially in reference to, you people are so stupid and savage that you can't rely on an oral tradition. You have to have a written document explaining your religion. We just started this thing. This is like the first meeting that was ever held. So it did not last for very long. Obviously, this created great rifts within tribes and among tribes in how to approach this. And also, moreover, difficulties and problems within tribal sovereignty and how they overlap with economic pressure and opportunity. On one hand, a lot of critics were saying that the federal government is being colonial and they're offering goods and services that are too difficult to pass up. It's too hard to say no. So they're essentially bribing these communities into taking these facilities. On the other hand, well, we're all about tribal sovereignty now. Isn't it in their interest that they can make the deals that they want to make? It's tough. It's a really tough part of history. And I would definitely recommend this reference if this seems interesting to you. Very influential, not just talking about these meetings. They go very in depth into these meetings, but also about the wider context as a whole. Yeah.
What exactly were they proposing to give takers of this facility? Like, I'd imagine if it was just a regular county or state level thing, they could offer subsidies or, some kind of tax exemptions.
It was money. Tribes are tax exempt, luckily.
Right. Like, so how does that work?
But so they would receive money, and then I think in the negotiations that were going on, they were going to do like infrastructure, like schools and roads and stuff. That was to be determined, and ultimately that never really got it. Any other questions before I talk about the end of this thing? So they didn't let. Oh yeah, one thing. Yeah, what's up?
Do they ever consider territories at all?
That's a good question. I think they did. If I'm remembering right, they authorized that these could be sited in like Puerto Rico and also in Panama, because at the time Panama was a U.S. territory, or at least the Canal Zone. They call it the Canal Zone. If you go back and look at the Atomic Energy Act of 1954, they use that language. And so yes, but also that kind of defeats the whole purpose of what the DOE was trying to do with trying to consolidate it into one part and then throw it somewhere else. Like if we're sending it off to some island in the Pacific that's a territory, I mean, it would be pretty tough. And same with the repositories. Why can't we do repositories on small island nations in the Pacific? We said that ocean disposal was not the smartest thing, so we're going to try to put it on the mainland. So Office of the Nuclear Waste Negotiator did not last for very long. They were founded in 1990 and they went away in 1995. That was the limit that was set by Congress, and Congress just didn't renew it. The Mescalero Apache in New Mexico were the final site. They were gonna take it. They passed a referendum in the tribe, so the people were on board. At least the majority were, but they lost support over time. They had support with utilities and such, and they had financial problems, and so that eventually fell away. They had one more negotiator after Leroy. I feel like his name was also David. There's a lot of Davids around. I might not. And also that the progress of the monetary retrieval storage is ultimately tied to the repository program. The repository program is not looking too hot at this time, and they're saying we can't reliably cite a monetary retrieval storage if we can't even get a repository off the ground. So the insights into this, interactions with Native American tribes, very complex, frequently historically problematic, and there's a lot to learn from there, which I would definitely recommend if you have the time. Immediately after the Office of the Nuclear Waste Negotiator was dissolved, a group of, or it was around the time that they were closing, but a group of private utilities led primarily by Xcel Energy, if anybody's from Minnesota. It's your utility provider. They got together and said, we need to try to figure this out ourselves. So they approached the Skull Valley Goshute Band of Indians. They're southwest of Salt Lake City in Utah. And they said, hey, we know that you've been talking to the nuclear waste negotiator, and we know they picked the Mescaler Apache. How about you work with us? I said, okay, sure. So they got it licensed eventually, notwithstanding a lot of legal and political issues of the time. Most importantly, Skull Valley is a tribe of like 70 people, and their leadership is, I think, one guy at the time. And so he was on board. The reason why I think his title was chair, I believe. The reason why he wanted it was because the land was already pretty bad anyways as a result of nuclear testing in the area and such. So may as well just lean into it, try to take advantage of what we can, try to get the money out of it. They were offered an undisclosed amount of money. I think estimates were about like $1 million per person, which is not bad. So I could use $1 million. But they eventually got this license by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in 2006. And in response, Utah said, no, you're not. And then they blocked off the roads from high-level waste transport. And the state passed a law, and the tribal laws and state laws are kind of entirely separate. So tribes can't really do anything about the state, and the state can't really do anything about the tribes. And so Skull Valley and this consortium led by Xcel Energy said, okay, we're going to try to make a railway to try to get around the roads. And the Department of the Interior, because it's on reservation lands, and any projects on reservations need to be approved by the Department of the Interior, because that's the way that our government is structured. They denied that request because they said that there were insufficient environmental assessments and that there were land use conflicts with the Department of Defense. These were not for the waste facility. These were for the railroad. And so this eventually just languished, and then they canceled it because we can't get a rail, we can't get a road, not much we can really do here. Yeah.
Why didn't the power company sue the state of Utah for a Commerce Clause violation?
I think that's a good question. I think they were able to do so because it's not necessarily commerce.
Well, it's interstate commerce because you have a corporation in 2 states.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm not entirely sure. And that's, of course, not to say that I can't say for certainty whether that didn't happen. There were a lot of lawsuits at the time. So I think that would work. I think the issue is because it was a regulatory thing with the hazardous waste. Yeah. Question over there?
No, based on my understanding, because I'm a public policy student, we did a simulation about this year.
About this?
About low-level hazardous waste.
Oh, cool.
And basically, with the Commerce Clause, like I think because the waste is also coming, like it'd be like if they blocked waste from out of state but not the in-state, but since they're blocking all the waste, I think it might be okay.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. Unfortunately, I'm not a lawyer. I just pretend to be one sometimes. Yeah, that seems like it makes sense. I'm sure that they use that argument, but it didn't go through. Additionally, there were 2 other projects. One that was started by Holtec, if anybody knows that name. They're restarting Palisades west of us. And they cited one in Lee County, New Mexico, which I believe is the same county as WIP. They got a license for that in 2021. And then Orono and another group, Waste Control Specialists, for those of you who know your low-level waste, they together cited a consolidated storage facility in Andrews, Texas, which was just on the other side of the Texas border to Lee County. There were challenges to this. People sued the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, people being Texas, regarding the NRC's authority of whether or not they could license this stuff. Their argument was nothing in the Nuclear Waste Policy Act or in the Atomic Energy Act would lead anybody to infer that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is allowed to defer this consolidated storage to private interests, that this was something that was supposed to be managed by the federal government. And so this went up to the court, but there was another issue, there was a procedural issue that because I'm not a lawyer I won't talk about, but that was what was ruled on in the case that went to the Supreme Court just last year. They did not rule necessarily on the substance, they ruled on the procedure. And so here's a quote by Justice Gorsuch on it in his dissent. "The law does not permit the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to license private companies to store spent nuclear fuel at private away from reactor facilities. The NWPA expressly prohibits that course, and cobbled together terms addressing other matters in the AEA cannot be repurposed to authorize what the NWPA forbids." So he was pretty clear on that. And in his dissent, he was very critical that the court was focusing on the procedural matter rather than the substance. So that's that. It might get brought up again, maybe it won't, I don't know. If you want to read more about that, I wrote a piece for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists with Professor Verma and Rafi, who came here to listen. Thank you for coming, thank you. So he helped me with that, and then we summarized this case back before it happened in 2025, and later that year in 2025, I think it was in 25, it might have been this year, Holtec canceled their site. Their permit was held valid, but they canceled it because they came to an untenable path forward with their friends in Lee County, which is strange because Lee County is the one with WIP. Anyways. So nothing's really happened on that front either. We can see that these bottom-up approaches and trying to invite siting lead to their own unique challenges, especially cultural and social ones, maybe not as much as the institutional problems that we were seeing with the repository project. There was consistently more buy-in. It was clear that the local communities were at least interested in a lot of these stuff, Skull Valley, Mescalero, Apache. There were other ones around the country that wanted to take part too. But that this also highlights a lot of tensions between political power and economic pressure and economic opportunity, and how all those combine into this policy problem. And still, legal ambiguities remain among whether the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has the authority to license these types of facilities. Any thoughts, questions on consolidated storage here? All right. So just very quickly, we've got two more. I'll talk about reprocessing and low-level waste. So I mentioned that reprocessing was banned in 1977. That was not the most correct term. Instead, the program was deferred or just postponed by President Carter in 1977. And in 1981 by President Reagan. That decision was reversed, but there was enough of an economic, I mean, the demand was gone. There was no economic basis to this at all. People in Europe and Japan were doing it, but it just completely stalled out here because we lost those really just 4 years. The reason why that ban happened in the first place was primarily due to proliferation concerns. In 1953, it was President Eisenhower in his Atoms for Peace speech, and he was talking about reasonable flow of uranium and plutonium for peaceful uses. And so that was the approach until 1974, when the Indian government detonated a secret plutonium bomb from plutonium they took from a Canadian test reactor that was given to them. So proliferation concerns got a lot more heightened at this time. And so that was what influenced the decision to ultimately cancel the program. It was not outlawed, it was not illegal, just like what we were saying with Yucca Mountain. They can't really make any laws, technically, but they just canceled R&D funding and there was no interest, and it's not like anybody's gonna go reprocess fuel in their backyard. Like, that's difficult to do. And just about a month ago, the Department of Energy awarded a whole bunch of money for this, because they can, because there were no laws saying that they couldn't. They just went and did it because there was renewed interest. And so hopefully we'll be having some more reprocessing projects back online. Yeah.
Who did they award it to?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I don't remember off the top of my head. Anybody else know? Yeah. I think it was 3 companies. I think there were companies. I don't think there were labs. Yeah, I don't remember off the top of my head who they were awarded to. That was reprocessing. So a short story. Basically, we stopped doing development for 4 years, and then we never got back to it until just now. So hopefully we'll see some more developments there, but until that point, yeah.
This is, maybe I don't understand reprocessing correctly, but is this part of the same push that Department of Energy is doing to like recycle the critical minerals? This is the exact same thing.
Yeah. That's so reprocessing, recycling, all one and the same. I think so. I would say it's the same thing. But yeah, so it's in the president made a whole bunch of executive orders. I guess 2 years ago now. Time flies. 5 companies. Who were they?
Let's see. Alpha Nur Inc., Curio Solutions LLC, Flybe Energy, Onclo Inc., and Shine Technologies.
So yeah, startup companies, right? Yeah. So this is all a push by the new Department of Energy. This is all very recent stuff, and I don't necessarily know if it was in the critical minerals, but it was part of a larger package with executive orders that were passed specifically for nuclear development. Yeah.
Is there a concern that like these startups can't do it, or not necessarily?
I think all concerns are valid. I mean, the technology is there. We know how to do this reprocessing because Europe and Japan have been doing it. And we were also doing this back in like the 50s and 60s. Like we talk about Gen 4 stuff. Like Gen 4 is not Gen 4. Gen 4 is Gen 0. That was the first stuff that we were doing. Same with reprocessing. It's like, this is very old stuff. And so is there a concern that they can't do it? You tell me. Are you concerned? I don't know. But certainly there's a risk in the Department of Energy. I'm assuming it's through the Loan Program Office. Maybe it's the grants. But yeah, they're willing to take that risk.
France, they've been doing it for a long time.
France has been doing it for a while. Yeah.
Maybe we need to plan the trip.
Yeah, that'd be fun. Unfortunately, I'm not the guy for that. I think that might also play into a little bit. I don't, and also Professor Verma is the better authority for this, because there was the EDF. I don't know entirely what the Electricité de France, I don't know what their relationship with the European Atomic Energy Agency was, so, or Euratom. I don't know whether those standards that they passed back in the 70s, I don't know whether or not France was complying with them. So yeah, they've been doing it for a while. They've had their breeder reactors, it's like Super Phoenix or whatever. So yeah. Final one, low-level waste. Very short history, but if you've talked about low-level waste before, hopefully you can spot anything if you have to add. But the Low-Level Radioactive Waste Policy Act was passed in 1980. They did not want to name this one after the person who wrote it, and I don't know who did. And essentially, it was Congress saying, it's your problem now. We're dealing with this other stuff. We don't have time. You figure it out. So it was now on the states to figure out what to do with the low-level waste. And just like the DOE was assuming financial responsibility for any damages that were incurred for improper management or development, the states were now responsible. So if we're producing a whole bunch of low-level waste that is not being properly taken into these facilities at states, then states have to pay. This was amended in 1985 to approve for compacts. Congress was not expecting states to work by themselves on this. They were expecting them to team up, which is very nice. And so today we have commercial sites in Washington, South Carolina, Utah, and Texas, and we used to have another one in Nevada, but that one closed. So here's the map of them all, and you can see very storied alliances between states like Vermont and Texas are partnering on stuff like this. And so, yeah, you can see them here. Unfortunately, I don't really know the story necessarily of what states in blue are doing, but my understanding is that they, at one point, were involved in trying to get their own low-level waste sites, and somehow they manage it. Or they might send it off to Utah or something. But yeah. That's it. So we talked about the history of repositories, consolidated storage, reprocessing, low-level waste, and we have 5 minutes left. So any other final questions? Yeah? Question? Thank you.
I'm just counting.
Counting.
I'm looking at where the 4 are.
Yeah. And there was another one up there in Nevada, the Rocky Mountain region. But my understanding is that most everything gets sent to Utah these days. They have the biggest facility, I think. Yeah. Any questions on anything before we wrap up? Any lingering thoughts? Would you have done anything differently?